So that was a really great introduction. Yeah, one thing I should say about myself is I actually started out doing a PhD, which was about the emerging far right and specifically its connection to kind of digital anti-feminist sort of groups. And since then, yeah, I've worked as a researcher and a reporter for the QAnonymous podcast, which I should stress because I'm aware the name is slightly ambiguous, is an anti-QAnon podcast, which looks at things like misinformation and conspiracy theories. And so it's in this capacity that I have been monitoring the anti-lockdown movement and their various channels, as well as attending a couple of marches of various types. But I'm going to speak specifically about the anti-lockdown context here. So this is just going to be a really brief overview of my sort of impressions of the UK movement specifically, and things which I think are really important to understand about it contextually, because it is quite different to how it is in other countries. So in this context, there's not going to be a lot of granular detail here, but I'm very happy afterwards to sort of answer questions about anything you feel I've sort of glided over a bit. So I think one thing that can be missed quite easily because they have a very significant overlap in the UK is that anti-lockdown and anti-vaccine movements are actually two different movements. And this is a lot more obvious actually in other countries where they're represented often by very two different political tendencies. But here, when it comes to organising, the groups have actually mostly merged. And I think there's a couple of reasons why I think this is. I think the anti-vaccine movement is still pretty small here compared to, for example, some countries like France and Poland. Most people here, when asked, say that they're likely to get the vaccine. So the anti-vaccine movement here, I think, is forced to piggyback on the much more successful anti-lockdown movement for transmitting its message. So this necessarily means that the kind of anti-vaccine, anti-lockdown, COVID skeptic sort of movement network is a very, very big tent. And even though I study conspiracy theories, not all of them necessarily are. So for instance, I might disagree with someone, but it's not necessarily conspiratorial thought to say that the COVID vaccine can have negative side effects and decide not to take it on those grounds. In order for a belief to become a conspiracy theory, it needs to have a system of thought which relies on a secretive group of agents, a classic cabal with sinister intentions. And this is very commonly found in the idea that sort of COVID is a hoax, which is really common in the sort of marketing materials that these groups put out, because it bolsters their case essentially that lockdowns are necessary. But they can get much more lurid and sort of bizarre. And I think particularly in an era when more people are stuck indoors and going on the internet more, which is, especially on social media, just this kind of cacophony of all these sort of various pieces of information trying to grab attention. Those ideas travel a lot further because they're exciting. And that's something I kind of want to ensure that I don't repeat in my reporting. So I'll give you an example. There's kind of a prominent theory in COVID skeptic circles that Bill Gates is deliberately poisoning COVID vaccines in order to eliminate 9/10 of the population and institute something called the Great Reset. And it's such an alarming, super villainesque idea that it naturally kind of grabs your attention and naturally travels further. But actually, most of the people in the anti-lockdown movement I've spoken to are much less certain than that. They're not like necessarily sure what it is that they think exactly. They just sort of know, or I suppose they sort of just feel very strongly that what is happening is, is wrong in some way. Now, there obviously is a lot of misinformation out there regarding both COVID itself and vaccines. And I do think this plays a really significant role in people's understanding. But I also think we should be careful to avoid ideas that misinformation itself is just some kind of, magic spell that immediately just kind of turns you into an extremist the second you set eyes upon it. Because I think it's true that, a lot of prominent figures in what we might call the kind of loose COVID skeptic network are charismatic, they're persuasive. But this is true of pretty much any political movement. So its appeal specifically has to kind of lie somewhere else. And it makes sense to me to use the United Kingdom anti-lockdown movement as a bit of a case study here, not least because it's the one I'm most familiar with, but because some parts of it seem so different to other countries. So, for example, the anti-lockdown movement here is not actually particularly partisan. And a great comparison here is in the United States, where there's a huge overlap with Trump support and the MAGA movement in general. And that follows kind of a pattern of things like the QAnon conspiracy theory, which again in the US is very closely correlated with identifying as sort of Republican. But here it has remained sort of largely disconnected from any political party or its political membership. And we can even see, I think we've got a really nice example with the London mayoral elections, where the anti-lockdown movement actually had two candidates, Piers Corbyn and Laurence Fox, which almost seemed like they were from the left and the right of the movement, respectively. So I can go into sort of lots of reasons on why that is, but I think a really significant difference here that's part of the context in the UK is that it comes down to one of trust, and trust specifically in the public institutions that are providing kind of public health measures. So it seems to me that in the UK, vaccine skepticism is comparatively low because most people trust the NHS, and for better or for worse, they don't necessarily view it as a particularly political institution. And on a side note, that's sort of great for vaccine uptake, but it's not particularly good for liberals or people on the left who want to highlight how much of the NHS is actually underfunded. Lockdown, on the other hand, is considered very stably to be the kind of realm of the government. And we can see that each time we've had one, public support has decreased and the anti-lockdown movement on social media has grown exponentially. So I think it's tempting to attribute this kind of quite simply to just people getting sick of lockdown, people being fed up with it all. But I think there's more to the story. So one thing that I've noticed is that conspiracy theories, which kind of fuel a lot of the anti-lockdown movement, have actually sprung from people noticing contradictions in government advice. So I interviewed one guy at the anti-lockdown march last month, who said that he thought COVID was a hoax because of how just improbable it seemed to him that you could supposedly catch the disease from seeing a friend at their house, but not from sitting down in a restaurant. Now, he's not wrong necessarily for noticing that those two restrictions don't line up from a public health perspective. But where I think he is wrong in how he's tried to explain them. Now, there's lots of things I'd like to think I would have done differently had I been in charge of government communications over the last couple of years. But I think a really significant misstep here was the very hazily defined floating of vaccine passports, which, from my point of view, watching these kind of anti-lockdown and COVID skeptic movements, completely misjudged essentially the public relationship with COVID health measures. So for one thing, it was given as a very loosely sketched out idea, which was then left for the media to speculate on, which they of course did. And then the anti-lockdown movement took that and speculated even further. And this led to many very well publicized, quite sort of offensive statements on their part on how we were ushering in an era of medical apartheid, and in some cases even wearing Star of David badges, which were clearly designed to resemble Nazi Germany, which read non-vaccinated. Now, I think, there's good reasons and bad reasons to oppose vaccine passports in certain forms. But from a practical level, I think that kind of proposal and that sort of total ambiguity about what it would involve galvanized the anti-lockdown and anti-vaccine movements at a time when they really should have been losing steam as things were opening up again, as restrictions were gradually loosening. So we got several marches of, by my estimation, a good few thousand people specifically galvanizing around this issue. And it sort of almost gave them fuel to kind of create more fear-mongering content and misinformation circulating around a new target this time. So in terms of what we can do next, at the time I've spent watching this movement, it sort of increases. Oh, sorry, I've just been joined by my cat. I've become increasingly convinced that the best way to tackle them isn't actually head on with, with debunking clear myths and that sort of thing. I think it's useful to have resources like that where it's explained in very clear language, exactly why certain things that look like they have the veneer of scientific authority don't. So for example, things like 5G towers causing COVID, or that vaccines don't contain certain chemicals and this sort of thing, I think is useful. But in a way, I think they almost feel slightly like band-aid treatments for the underlying cause of a lot of these reasons, which is, less that somebody saw something that convinced them and more like a kind of general feeling or sense of mistrust and alienation from the institutions that are meant to protect us. So I think there's a few different things that can be done about this, but I think one of them is it's really important to promote public health measures in a way that's kind of celebratory and not just threatening. I think we shouldn't forget that this crisis has brought out some of humanity's really nice impulses, from local with mutual aid networks, springing up to campaigns like this one, to, the kind of international scale with kind of scientists, doctors and charities all collaborating to try and ensure the poorest countries get access to life-saving vaccines. But I do think we also have to kind of recognize that public mistrust isn't just born out of what our institutions say, but what they do. And public support for health measures and restrictions, I think this year has been really clear in illustrating, aren't just kind of an infinitely renewable source that you can keep topping up by essentially saying the right things. And so I think repairing that trust is something that needs to be looked into even after it feels like the immediate threat of COVID has gone, at least in this country. Kind of sort of thinking to the future, it doesn't really feel like to me like this movement is going to die down anytime soon. And so I think we need to be aware that it will be more prepared essentially for another pandemic or another kind of crisis like this. So that's my sort of, my slight kind of words of doom there. But I think, we actually have a chance now to kind of prepare for it in a way that we didn't before.